I'm a Tonechaser. That thing you hear in your head that you just can't quite get.
Hey everybody, how are you? Everybody doing good? Surviving the heat wherever you may be? So we're gonna dive into another read through. I think you guys have been digging that. I've been reading the comments, and so we're gonna try another one here. So this is gonna be chapter 21 from Tonechaser, Old Ground, New Ground, and as that title suggests, or was meant to suggest, I was going to be talking to Edward about stuff we had spoken about earlier. And again, I write about this in the book that, I would ask him stuff and then I'd think for some reason, hey, I want to talk to him more about that. And so I'd ask him again, and typically we'd get different kinds of answers and stuff. And then new ground, of course, there's stuff that I'd never spoken to him about. So I'm going to do a little bit of a read through, and I'll comment on sections as they hit me. And then you're going to hear some audio from that interview, from that chapter, which the interview actually took place on December 7th, 1984. And again, thank you to my very good friend Adam Roach for putting all this together. Could not do this without him. Before we begin, I just wanted to show you one of the first books I sent out. Somebody wrote back to him and says, hey, my book was damaged. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, sometimes, the postal people would drop the package and a corner would get dented, and then I saw this and it's like, I thought, oh man, tell me that's not a harbinger of things to come. I'm going to find, 8,000 books with torn covers. But that was the only one. And for some reason, I use this book as sort of my go-to book, my go-to copy. I don't know. It just makes me so sick to see the book like that. But I don't know why I do it. But I wanted to share that with you. So you ready, guys? So here we go. Old Ground, New Ground. Interview back on December 7th, 1984. Edward had earlier described their impending sixth album as hellified, which in Van Halen vernacular meant breaking down walls, inventive, next-level shit. That was a word he'd never used before in any of our discussions about the first 5 albums, and it was almost as if he had been saving that particular adjective for just the perfect time. When I first spoke to him about what will become 1984, back about a year or so prior to the interview you're about to read, and about the interview you're about to hear, there was something in the way he talked about the music, a sense of purpose that struck me as being different than his tone during previous album-related conversations. Though I may not have applied that tag to the earlier albums, it didn't mean he was any less blown away by them. I know he gave himself over to each and every note he ever recorded, and loved all the records he made equally, but I believed he loved that impish cigarette-smoking angel baby adorning the cover of 1984 just a little more equally. I've said it many times, that was, in my mind, I believe that was Van Halen's high watermark, in as much as it took in so many new components and ideas. Obviously, he had toyed with keyboards, but now keyboard becomes the central focus on Jump, which becomes arguably one of their most, successful songs. He has the studio for the first time. The guitar tones have gone from just this organic, enormous thing to sort of this majestic thing. I'm not saying it's their best record. I don't know if it's my favorite record. It just, to me, struck me as sort of the equivalent of Dark Side of the Moon for Pink Floyd, or Crime of the Century for Supertramp. Where all those elements came together. Edward's writing, and lyrically Dave was saying some interesting things. So anyway, that's my take on that. A lot of blood, frets, and tears had gone into the making of the album, from the creation of 5150 and bringing keyboards more to the forefront to taking a more prominent and hands-on approach in terms of production and overall direction. For Ed, that must have felt like some kind of personal victory, a triumph over obstacles which had previously stood in his way. which is maybe why he described it as hellified. That was his way of saying, "Hey, I'm finally at the reins. I'm really the captain of the ship now." So when I drove to 5150 on December 7th, 1984, I shouldn't have been surprised to find him in a buoyant mood. Returning from the 99-date 1984 tour on September 2nd and decompressing for about 3 months before we spoke, that was an Edward Van Halen on fire, man. He was not only jazzed about the success of the tour, but jacked and hyper-pumped like a rock-hard football. I'll entertain you with a sports tale a couple quarters from now about the way that album turned out. And those of you who read the book know the Raiders story, and those of you who haven't read the book, you need to read it to learn that story. He was the conqueror come home, done battling naysayers and skeptics, and returning to tell the world what he discovered out there on the edges of his own unmapped creativity. There was a sense of urgency, of great expectations hanging in the air that day, over 37 years ago, and I know Edward felt it because I could see it there in the turn of his smile and the twinkling, yes, a twinkling in his eyes. He may not have known how to define that feeling in any way or articulate it in even the simplest way, but I knew in bringing 1984 to life, he felt a spark, a burning ember deep inside his marrow that had never been there before. All of that was reflected in his willingness to engage that afternoon. He wanted to talk and had a lot to talk about. Ostensibly, I was there to discuss the album, but our conversation turned into so much more. So much so that I had to return 4 days later on December 11th to finish what we'd started. By the end of that second day, I realized I'd captured something special on tape. I called Guitar World the next day, December 11th, 1984 was a Sunday, and told them about the interview, and they kind of freaked out in a good way. They immediately grasped the importance of what I told them and ended up not only running my story as a cover of their July 1985 issue, and I think some of you, maybe a lot of you, have seen that. My second Van Halen cover in 2 years, but devoted the entire magazine over to Edward through various related articles and sidebars. To ensure maximal visibility, the mag produced a special promo card sent out to advertisers several months prior to publication. Here's what it said. And if you look in the photo section, you can see that little postcard with that beautiful photo that Glenn LaFerman took. The editors of Guitar World are proud to present a GW special issue, July 1985, The Life and Times of Edward Van Halen. The most influential guitarist of the modern age, in an exclusive interview with contributing editor Stephen Rosen, looks back on all the musical landmarks in his splendid career and forward to the kind of music you can expect to hear from him in the future. In deference to the specialness of this event, we at GW have decided to devote the bulk of our editorial package for the July 1985 issue to Van Halen's music. A triple-sized, awesomely illustrated interview with Van Halen, a series of encounters with some of the producers, road managers, engineers, and other guitarists who have worked with Ed on various musical projects. Needless to say, I was thrilled beyond all expectations when I received one of those promotional postcards in the mail, even if the copy read as if it had been written by a slow-moving 10-year-old with a fistful of Crayolas. Honestly, guys, I mean, who wrote that? They're not proper sentences. The wording is clumsy. I mean, I was almost embarrassed, except I wasn't because it was so cool. So you'll note the GW editorial staff titled the interview The Life and Times of Edward Van Halen, and there was a very specific reason for that. The story, though details and logistics had only been casually cobbled together at that point, was meant to represent the first installment of my book, which was going to be serialized on the pages of future Guitar World issues. Additionally, the book had the working title, The Life and Times of Edward Van Halen, which had been dreamed up by the GW editors. Back in February 1985, which would have been about 3 months prior to that magazine hitting the stands, all publications were typically available for sale months before the actual cover date, and that July issue hit the stands on May 7th. I signed that first rudimentary contract with Edward regarding the writing of his authorized biography that I described for you earlier. Again, you read about that, and in the picture section, you've seen a copy of that first one-paragraph contract that Edward and I signed, which in many ways was the first step for Tonechaser, what is that, 40, 45 years later. Yeah, so here we go. When I informed Guitar World about my life-transforming encounter surrounding the signing of the contract, heart rates around the New York office skyrocketed straight to apoplectic. If they had been feverishly anticipating the interview, they were step on a third rail zonked over the news of my signing of that contract. At that juncture, they suggested, or I may have even brought up the idea of running ongoing chapters in the magazine, and whoever came up with the idea, everybody was on board. I mentioned to you back at the outset of the book, as it was happening back in 1985, I was jubilant, and it was only later, and certainly now while writing this book, or telling you about this book, that I came to regret my decision. What you need to understand was writing for Guitar World in the mid-1980s was a powerful drug. I was intoxicated with the power of what it meant to be one of their go-to freelancers. The magazine was forward-thinking and took chances, and during that time was a leading light in the field of guitar-oriented publications. On top of that, they welcomed and encouraged my input, and well, that was Eddie stuff, man, for a 31-year-old knucklehead rock guitar journalist to have scored a gig like that. It really was, man. I mean, Guitar World, there was Guitar Player and Guitar World. Guitar Player was a little bit more traditional in their approach to the artists they covered. Guitar World took chances and was out there on the edge. And they did, man. They wanted to hear my ideas. And a lot of times they ran with them. And certainly the Van Halen issue, the Life and Times of Edward Van Halen was their idea, but certainly I would have prompted them. I was even anointed with the unofficial title of contributing editor, which was directly attributable to my association with Edward and the weight he carried. When I asked GW if I could carry the title of a contributing editor, they swiftly agreed, and I don't have a single doubt that if I hadn't come to them armed with that original Van Halen Us Festival story, and more poignantly, a friendship with Edward, my honorary position would have been as little more than a whisper on the wind. I mean, let's be honest about it. I was a good writer. I had some good ideas. I had a lot of contacts. But without Edward Van Halen sort of standing behind me with a shadow that, you know, covered the entire world, there was no way they were gonna make me a contributing editor. I knew that, but you know, I didn't think there was anything wrong with that. I was bringing them great stories, and most significantly, I was bringing them exclusive Edward Van Halen stories. So I thought that was okay, right? No, that wasn't the problem. What I truly regretted was ever mentioning the book to GW, and that's what sickens me to this day. Look, I wrote sickens. That's probably too harsh a word. I was just disappointed in myself that I had mentioned the book to them, and I'll read on it, and you'll understand why. I thought by running the stories as installments, that would generate interest in the book, and it did. I received tons of letters from readers. I included my name and address on a letters page in the magazine, which no writer had ever done. They hadn't, man. You had to be out of your mind to put your contact information in a magazine because you were going to be inundated. And I was, and I answered every letter, and I loved receiving those letters. I really did. And answered every single one, and realized in so doing that a groundswell was happening, and since there was tremendous interest in the progress of the book brought on by the publication of those ongoing installments. So everything I wanted to happen was happening, but be careful what you wish for, right? At the time, I was knocked sideways by all the enthusiasm and attention surrounding the book, but looking back on it now, I feel only remorse. There's the word, remorse. I think it diminished what the book was and what I believed it could be, and in some ways cheapened it. I was willing to toss away the gravitas and importance of it for what turned out to be a little more than free advertising. I wanted the stories to run and wanted people to read them. I did. I just didn't want anybody thinking there was a book involved and believing somehow those interviews would someday appear on the pages of that book. If I had written the stories as standalone pieces and never told Guitar World about my pending book, everything would have been great. As it was, I traded my dignity for a few pieces of gold, and I can tell you I was cheapened by it. That was my mistake, and I have to live with it. So let's dig a hole, bury remorse and regret deep inside it, and move forward. On December 7th, when I first walked into 5150, Edward reached out and hugged me, and I grabbed him back, and then he did something he'd never done before. He kissed me on both cheeks European style. You'd seen that on television where the French monsieur placed a manly peck on the cheek of his French ami. Edward's gesture of bonhomie and affection touched me deeply. I kissed him back on his cheek, and I think he was moved by that and smiled at me. I felt like our friendship was so deep then. That was such a great moment, and I can remember that clearly. And for Edward, it was a natural thing, right? It was that European thing, you know. I was a little taken aback because Americans don't kiss each other on the cheeks. But it was amazing, and yeah, I was incredibly touched by it, you know, and I thought, you know, somehow we had, you know, gone a step further in a friendship on that day. You know, on a day when Edward was in an amazing mood, and 1984 was happening, and Guitar World cover stories, and it was a beautiful day, you guys. Okay. Every minute spent in Edward's presence was a gift, but that felt as if it was wrapped in shiny red paper and crisscrossed with red and black stripes. Maybe it was all the outboard gear sitting there in the racks in 5150, all the power lights shining brightly. The effects were always turned on, or seemed to be, like electric eyes looking at us in silent, unblinking, unthinking wonderment. I'm stretching here, but I was aware, seemingly for the first time, of all the limiters, compressors, delays, preamps, patch bays, and rows of other effects lining the wall, and thinking this was Edward's laboratory, his playground, the room where his creations came to life. I was thinking about all that as I turned on the cassette player. Edward saw the tape revolving and chimed, "Hi, Steve." The salutation delivered in a very kind of light-hearted and even childlike way. I chimed back, "Hi, Edward." I wanted to keep that initial momentum going and tossed out a simple question I hadn't written down, but suddenly came to me. Looking back at 1984, the year 1984, how would you characterize the year 1984 for Van Halen? I mean, it was pretty productive, I'd say. Though the query was a simple one and admittedly redundant, I mean, I said 1984, the year, the day. I was just trying to distinguish between the two, guys, okay? How many times was I going to say 1984? It would open the door for a retrospective of what Edward had been doing the past year, which is exactly what I hoped it would do. I knew from Edward's first response how special that interview was going to be, and so did Guitar World. They would publish that conversation as a cover of their July 1985 issue with the attendant banner, The Guitar World Special, The Life and Times of Edward Van Halen, a 20-page exclusive with the world's most influential guitarist. I loved that tagline, which was both bold and sweeping, and felt it captured perfectly what transpired on that rare afternoon. Some of you reading these words may have previously read those words in GW, and even if you had, you only saw part of the story. Here was everything you didn't read, Edward Uncut. So that's the read-through, guys. I wanted to refer back to influential guitarists. I've said it before, I believe Edward was the most influential guitarist who ever lived. I believe that he influenced and touched and changed the arc of guitar playing more than any other guitar player. I'm not trying to take away a single thing from Eric Clapton or Jimi Hendrix or Jimmy Page or Ritchie Blackmore or, you know, Paul Kossoff in his approach to blues and Robin Trower on those first Procol Harum records. There's so many amazing records, but because Edward was able to access the computer world, he was able to reach so many more people than any of those other guitar players because they were pre-computer. So where, you know, a Jimmy Page article would reach maybe tens of thousands of fans, you know, a Van Halen interview and or album ultimately could reach hundreds of thousands. And so that was a huge part of it. And just the fact that Edward was building his own guitars, playing his own guitars, manufacturing his own guitars. It was just some kind of tsunami that I'd never seen before. And consequently why I call Edward the most influential guitarist who ever lived. So I hope you dug that, and I'm hoping you're going to dig the upcoming audio you're going to hear. For those of you who have the book, thank you so much. You can read along. For those of you who don't have the book, you know, please go check it out on my webpage, tonechaserbook.com. Pretty simple. There's some fun stuff there. So some cool photos and some other YouTube stuff and Instagram stuff and podcasts I've done. So I wish everybody well. I hope you guys have dug this little read through. Give me a shout, man. Let me know what else you'd like to see or hear from me. Read throughs, chapters, questions. I'm always here for you guys. I'm your biggest supporters. Okay. So you guys take care. Okay. Be good.